The bathroom in our house always had this annoying habit of trapping heat, turning the small space into a complete steam room within 5 minutes of turning on the faucet. It was an old colonial-style place in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, with creaky hardwood floors and a plumbing system that groaned every time you asked it to do its job. I had just gotten back from an exhausting, brutal 12-hour shift at the logistics firm where I worked as a regional operations manager. It was one of those days where everything that could go wrong did, from late freight deliveries to a massive software glitch that wiped out our tracking data for 3 entire states. By the time I pulled my crossover SUV into our driveway, my shoulders were locked tight with stress, and all I wanted was to dissolve under a stream of scalping hot water. My wife, Vanessa, had been working from her home office all afternoon, or at least that's what I assumed when I saw her sedan parked in its usual spot. When I walked through the front door, the house was remarkably quiet, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning and the distant sound of the television playing in the downstairs den. I called out her name as I tossed my keys into the ceramic bowl by the entryway, but there was no answer. I figured she either had her noise-canceling headphones on for a client call, or she had stepped out into the backyard to water the hydrangea she had been obsessively trying to keep alive all summer.
I didn't think twice about it. I just peeled off my sweat-stained button-down shirt, kicked off my loafers, and headed straight for the master bathroom. I turned the shower handle as far to the left as it would go, waiting for the water to transition from freezing to boiling. As the glass enclosure began to fog up, I stepped inside, letting out a massive sigh as the pressure hit the back of my neck. It felt incredible. The noise of the rushing water completely drowned out the rest of the world, creating a localized white noise machine that effectively isolated me from reality. For about 10 minutes, I just stood there with my eyes closed, letting the steam clear my head and trying to wash away the residue of a terrible workday. I was completely in my own zone, entirely disconnected from the physical space around me, which is probably why what happened next caught me so utterly off guard. Through the frosted glass of the shower door, the world outside was nothing more than a blur of muted colors and shifting shadows. I was in the middle of rinsing shampoo out of my hair, my eyes squinted shut against the sting of the soap, when I faintly heard the heavy click of the bathroom door opening. I didn't panic. I just assumed it was Vanessa. We had been married for 4 years, and the casual boundary blurring of long-term domestic life meant that walking in on each other while showering wasn't exactly a federal offense. I figured she was just coming in to grab a hair tie, check her makeup in the mirror, or ask me what I wanted to do about dinner, since neither of us had the energy to cook. "Hey, babe," I called out over the roar of the water, wiping the soap from my eyelids with the back of my hand. "Did you figure out what we're doing for food tonight? I'm honestly too dead to even think about driving anywhere." There was no verbal response, which was a bit unusual, but I heard the distinct sound of footsteps moving across the tiled floor toward the vanity. The shadow on the other side of the glass was larger than Vanessa's silhouette, moving with a heavier, more deliberate cadence. I reached out and wiped a wet palm across a section of the frosted glass to clear a small viewing window, squinting through the condensation. The shape standing next to the sink wasn't my wife. It was Mark, our next-door neighbor. Mark was a guy in his early 30s, a fitness trainer who lived alone in the newly renovated mid-century modern house across our shared lawn. He and Vanessa had become fast friends over the last 6 months, bonded by their mutual interest in marathon training and local community organizing. I liked Mark well enough. He was always polite, offered to lend me his high-end lawnmower when mine broke down, and frequently joined us on the back patio for casual weekend barbecues. But seeing him standing inside my private master bathroom, well past the threshold of our personal living space while I was completely naked in the shower, instantly sent a massive jolt of adrenaline straight to my chest. Before I could even process the sheer absurdity and intrusion of the situation to scream out or demand what the hell he was doing, the bathroom door creaked wider, and Vanessa stepped inside. She didn't look toward the shower. Her focus was entirely locked on Mark. She was wearing a loose silk robe, her hair slightly tousled, and the expression on her face was something I had never seen before. It wasn't the face of a homeowner discovering a trespasser. It was an expression of intense, desperate familiarity. "Did you find it?" she whispered, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bathroom with terrifying clarity. Mark didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver keyring, the spare set to our house that we keep hidden under a fake rock near the garage for emergencies.
He held them up with a wry, confident smirk that completely shattered any illusion of neighborly innocence. Yeah, it was exactly where you said it would be. We don't have to worry about him locking us out next time he leaves for a business trip. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The water was still pouring down on my head, hot and oppressive, but my skin suddenly felt freezing cold. I stood frozen behind the glass, paralyzed by a sickening wave of comprehension that hit me with the force of a physical blow. They thought I wasn't home. They thought the house was completely empty. My car was parked in the driveway, but because I had hurried inside so quickly and gone straight upstairs, they must have assumed I had taken an Uber back to the office or left with a colleague. They had no idea I was standing right there, less than 3 feet away from them, separated only by a thin pane of translucent glass. Vanessa stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them with a natural ease that felt like a knife twisting into my gut. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around his forearm, her touch lingering in a way that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or innocent explanations. "He's supposed to be at the regional conference in Cleveland all day tomorrow," she said, her voice dropping into a low, intimate register that made me sick to my stomach. "We have the entire afternoon. He thinks I'm going to be at the co-working space downtown." Mark smiled, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her forehead, right at the hairline. "Perfect. I'll make sure the schedule is clear. I hate having to rush through this, V." They stood there for another 10 seconds, whispering logistics about times, entries, and cover stories, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire reality was being dismantled right next to them. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My hand was still pressed against the glass, my fingers trembling so violently that I was terrified I would accidentally rattle the door and alert them to my presence. A dark, primal instinct told me to stay quiet, to keep watching, to gather every shred of undeniable evidence before the trap snapped shut. If I confronted them right now, naked and dripping wet, the chaos would allow them to scramble, to lie, to construct some elaborate gaslighting narrative before I could get my bearings. I needed to see exactly how deep this betrayal ran. Finally, Mark pocketed the keys, gave her waist a gentle squeeze, and slipped back out of the bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. Vanessa stood by the sink for a long moment, taking a deep breath and checking her reflection in the mirror, smoothing down her hair and adjusting her robe. She looked perfectly calm. There was no visible guilt, no hesitation, no sign of a woman who had just compromised her marriage in the most calculated way possible. She turned around and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. I stood under the streaming water for a long time after they left, the heat turning my skin bright red, though I couldn't feel it at all. The silence of the house settled back in, heavy and suffocating. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man living right across the driveway had just been violently rewritten in the span of 5 minutes. The water had gone completely cold by the time I finally turned the handle off. The sudden silence in the bathroom was deafening, broken only by the slow, rhythmic drip from the shower head hitting the drain. I stood there shivering, not from the temperature, but from the raw, unadulterated shock coursing through my veins. My mind was operating at 1,000,000 miles an hour, desperately trying to find an alternative explanation for what I had just witnessed, but the reality was unyielding. My wife and our neighbor were sleeping together. They were planning their encounters around my work schedule, using our own emergency house keys to facilitate it, and doing it all with a casual efficiency that suggested this had been going on for a very long time. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel around my waist, my hands shaking so violently I could barely secure the knot. Looking at myself in the vanity mirror, I looked exactly the same, but I felt like a ghost inhabiting a stranger's body. The air in the room felt thick and hard to breathe. I had to get out of the bathroom before Vanessa came back up, or worse, before she realized my car was in the driveway and put 2 and 2 together. I needed time to think, to plan, and to ensure that I didn't lose my mind and do something I would regret. I quietly crept down the hallway toward the master bedroom, keeping my footsteps light on the floorboards I knew tended to creak. I grabbed a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt from the closet, dressing with frantic, clumsy movements. My phone was sitting on the nightstand, its screen illuminating with a notification from a coworker about a project deadline. It felt utterly surreal that the mundane machinery of my normal life was still functioning, while my personal world had just suffered a catastrophic meltdown. I picked up the phone, stuffed it into my pocket, and took a deep, steadying breath. I needed a cover story for why I was home early, and I needed it now. Walking down the stairs felt like descending into a courtroom where I was both the judge and the victim. I found Vanessa in the kitchen, casually pouring herself a glass of chilled white wine. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, her expression instantly shifting from relaxed contentment to sudden, stark surprise. It was subtle, just a slight widening of her eyes and a brief tightening of her jaw, but now that the scales had fallen from my eyes, I could read her perfectly. "Oh, hey babe," she said, her voice pitching slightly higher than usual as she set the wine bottle down on the quartz island. "I didn't hear you come in. I thought your car wasn't in the driveway." I parked on the street. I lied, my voice sounding incredibly flat and hollow in my own ears. The city had those orange cones blocking the lower half of the driveway for the curb repairs, so I just grabbed a spot down by the fire hydrant. I came straight upstairs to take a shower. I was completely exhausted. She stared at me for a second, her brain visibly processing the explanation, calculating whether her secret was safe. "Oh, right, the city maintenance. I forgot they were doing that today. How was the rest of your shift? You look exhausted." "It was brutal," I said, walking over to the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water just to give my hands something to do. I kept my back to her for a few seconds, terrified that if she looked into my eyes, she would see the blinding rage and betrayal burning behind them. "Just a lot of fires to put out. I think I'm just going to crash early tonight." "That's probably a good idea," she replied, stepping closer to me and placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch made my stomach turn. It was the exact same hand I had just seen resting intimately on Mark's arm moments before. "You've been pushing yourself so hard lately, Tyler. You need to rest, especially with that big regional conference in Cleveland tomorrow." Hearing her mention the conference, the very event she and Mark were planning to exploit for their afternoon rendezvous, almost broke my composure. A wave of pure heat rushed up my neck, and I had to clench my jaws so hard my teeth ached to keep from screaming the truth in her face. She was standing there, acting like a caring, supportive wife, while simultaneously counting down the hours until I left the city so she could invite the man from next door into our bed. "Yeah," I muttered, pulling away under the guise of taking a long sip from my water bottle. "The Cleveland trip. I actually think I might have to handle most of it remotely from the local office here. The driving is just too much with my back acting up." I watched her face closely as I threw out that little piece of bait. The reaction was instantaneous. A flicker of absolute panic crossed her features before she quickly masked it with a tight, forced smile. "Oh, really? But I thought the regional director specifically asked you to be there in person? You wouldn't want to miss that networking opportunity, babe. You've been working toward that vice president promotion for 2 years." It was sickening how easily the manipulation flowed from her lips. She wasn't worried about my career or my promotion. She was actively managing the logistics of her affair, making sure her window of opportunity didn't slam shut. "We'll see," I said indifferently, walking past her into the living room. "I'll check my emails later and make a final call. I'm going to lay down for a bit." I went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and locked it. I threw myself onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling as the twilight outside faded into a deep, heavy darkness. The betrayal felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. Vanessa and I had been together since our mid-20s. We had built this life together, bought this house, talked about starting a family next year. I had trusted her completely, never once questioning her late-night gym sessions, her sudden interest in marathon training, or the long afternoons she spent working from coffee shops. Now, every memory of the past 6 months was tainted, recontextualized into a giant, mocking lie. I pulled out my phone and opened our shared bank account app, my fingers scrolling through the recent transactions with a newfound sense of suspicion. Nothing stood out at first, just standard grocery trips, gas stations, and online shopping. But then I looked closer at the cash withdrawals. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 months, there was a $50 ATM withdrawal from a location right next to a boutique hotel on the outskirts of the city. I checked my calendar. Those were the exact days I had my late-night management meetings. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying precision, forming a picture of a calculated, systemic betrayal that made me realize I didn't know the woman sleeping down the hall at all. She wasn't just slipping up, she was living a double life. And Mark, the friendly neighbor who had helped me chop down a dead oak tree in the backyard just last month, was happily playing the accomplice, laughing at me behind my back every time we shook hands over the fence. The rage that followed the sadness was cold and analytical. I realized that if I confronted them now, she would deny it, call me paranoid, clean her phone, and coordinate with Mark to make me look like a lunatic. In a divorce court in this state, text messages and vague suspicions didn't mean much without definitive proof, especially when it came to dividing our assets and the equity in this house that I had paid for with my own sweat and blood. I needed undeniable, concrete evidence. I needed to let them think they were safe, so they would walk right into the trap they had built for themselves. I sat up on the edge of the bed, the darkness of the room enveloping me. Tomorrow was the day of the Cleveland conference. I was going to let her believe I was driving 2 hours away. I was going to leave the house at 6 in the morning, just like I always did, but I wouldn't be going to Cleveland. I would be staying right here in the neighborhood, watching from the shadows, waiting for Mark to use that silver key to walk through my front door. The next morning arrived with a cold, gray dawn that matched the hollow feeling inside my chest. I got out of bed at 5:30, making sure to make enough noise to simulate my usual frantic routine before a long drive. Vanessa was still under the covers, her eyes half open, watching me with a sleepy, calculated gaze as I tied my tie in front of the closet mirror. She murmured a quick, performative goodbye, telling me to drive safe on I-71 and reminding me to text her when I reached the hotel conference center in Cleveland. I leaned down and kissed her cheek, forcing myself to endure the touch of her skin, which now felt entirely foreign to me. I muttered a response, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out the front door, making sure the heavy deadbolt clicked loudly behind me. I pulled my crossover out of the driveway, driving down our quiet suburban street, just as the morning neighborhood traffic was starting to wake up. I didn't head toward the highway. Instead, I drove 3 blocks over to a strip mall parking lot, tucked my car behind a row of commercial delivery vans where it wouldn't be easily spotted, and waited. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I checked my watch. It was 6:15. According to their little bathroom conversation, the rendezvous wasn't scheduled until early afternoon, which meant I had hours of agonizing silence ahead of me. I spent the morning sitting in the driver's seat of my car, staring blankly out the windshield, watching commuters head off to their respectable, ordinary lives. I felt entirely untethered from reality, like an observer watching a horror movie where I was the main character. At 10:30, I ordered a small, portable security camera through a local electronics store's curbside pickup app. I drove to the store, grabbed the box without making eye contact with the cashier, and unboxed it in my front seat. It was a compact, battery-powered unit that linked directly to an app on my phone, offering a crystal-clear live stream. By noon, the tension in my muscles had reached a breaking point. I couldn't just sit in the parking lot anymore. I drove back toward our neighborhood, parking a street over behind a dense line of maple trees that bordered the community park. From this vantage point, walking through the small wooded trail, I could access the blind spot at the rear of my own property without being seen from the street or from Mark's front windows. I slipped through the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears, feeling like a thief in my own life. The backyard was completely deserted. I used my physical key to quietly unlock the back basement door, stepping into the cool, musty darkness of the lower level. Every sound in the house seemed magnified tenfold. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs for a full 2 minutes, listening intently for any footsteps or voices upstairs. Nothing. Vanessa was likely still in her home office on the 2nd floor, or perhaps downstairs watching television, waiting for the clock to hit the designated hour. I crept up the basement stairs, barefoot so my loafers wouldn't betray me, and slipped into the main living room. I needed to place the camera in a location that provided an unobstructed view of the front entryway and the living room sofa, but remained entirely invisible to a casual glance. I decided on the high bookshelf in the corner, tucking the small black cube behind the leaves of a faux ivy plant that Vanessa had placed there months ago. I adjusted the angle, opened the app on my phone, and verified the feed. The view was perfect. It captured the entire living area, the front door, and the hallway leading back toward the master bedroom. Once the trap was set, I retreated back down into the darkness of the basement. I sat on an old plastic storage bin in the corner, surrounded by boxes of holiday decorations and old college textbooks, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my phone. The basement was freezing, but sweat was dripping down the back of my neck. At exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, the screen on my phone flickered with motion. My breath caught in my throat. The front door opened, and Vanessa walked into the frame. She wasn't wearing her usual work-from-home sweatpants. She was wearing a dark blue summer dress I had bought her for our anniversary last year. Her hair styled perfectly, a radiant smile on her face that she rarely directed at me anymore. She stood by the foyer, looking out the sidelight window toward the driveway, checking the street. A moment later, a shadow crossed the porch, and the sound of a key turning in the lock echoed through the floorboards above my head. Mark walked in. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around like a man doing something wrong. He moved into the house with the easy, arrogant confidence of someone who owned the place. He was wearing a casual t-shirt and shorts, looking relaxed and entirely at home. As soon as the door closed behind him, Vanessa threw her arms around his neck. The sight on the screen was like a physical blow to my solar plexus, knocking the air right out of my lungs. I watched in absolute, agonizing silence as they kissed, a deep, familiar embrace that carried the weight of months, maybe years, of hidden intimacy. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. They looked like a couple celebrating a long-awaited reunion, completely unbothered by the fact that they were standing in the home I work 50 hours a week to pay for. "I told you he wouldn't suspect anything," Vanessa said, her voice coming through the phone speaker with terrifying digital clarity. She giggled, a sound that made my skin crawl, because it was a laugh she used to reserve only for me when we were younger. "He was so exhausted last night, he barely even looked at me. He thinks I'm his biggest cheerleader for that promotion." Mark laughed, a low, rumbling sound as he slid his hands down her waist. "The guy is oblivious, Fee. Honestly, it's almost too easy. He's so buried in his logistics metrics, he would notice if I moved into the spare bedroom." "Don't be mean," she chided playfully, though there wasn't a shred of genuine reprimand in her tone. She leaned in, whispering something directly into his ear that made him smile widely. He grabbed her hand, and together, they began walking toward the stairs, heading straight up toward our bedroom. I sat in the dark basement, the phone screen illuminating the tears of pure, blinding rage that were finally spilling down my cheeks. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the device. The sheer disrespect, the utter lack of remorse, and the mocking laughter at my expense broke something fundamental inside me. The sadness was entirely gone now, burned away by a freezing, calculated fury. I didn't storm up the stairs to confront them. I didn't scream or break things. Instead, I opened the screen recording feature on my phone, saving the entire interaction directly to my cloud drive, creating 3 separate backups. They were upstairs now, out of the camera's view, but the evidence I had already captured was more than enough to dismantle her entire narrative in a courtroom. I sat there in the dark for another 20 minutes, listening to the faint, muffled sounds from upstairs, my mind hardening into iron. I was no longer a victim waiting to be hurt. I was the architect of their ruin, and I was going to make sure that when the truth came out, there would be absolutely no escape for either of them. I waited in the stifling dark of the basement for what felt like an eternity, watching the static view of our empty living room on my phone screen, while the muffled noises from upstairs drove spikes into my brain. The clock on my screen crawled to 3:15 before footsteps finally echoed on the ceiling above. They came back down the stairs together, completely relaxed, laughing about a local restaurant they wanted to try over the weekend, while I was supposed to be handling a weekend inventory audit. I watched them exchange a final, lingering kiss by the front door. Mark slipped out, adjusting his sunglasses, and Vanessa locked the door behind him, letting out a satisfied sigh as she walked toward the kitchen to pour herself another glass of wine. I didn't rush up the stairs. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy resolve completely take over. I quietly slipped out the back basement door, retraced my steps through the wooded park trail, and walked back to my hidden car. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The grief had been entirely replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. I drove out of the neighborhood and pulled into the parking lot of a local coffee shop,
where I opened my laptop and began sending the screen recordings directly to my attorney, along with a detailed timeline of the cash withdrawals and text logs I had compiled over the last 24 hours. "We have everything we need," my lawyer texted back 10 minutes later. "This is definitive. I'll have the paperwork drafted by tomorrow morning." I didn't go back home until 8 o'clock that evening, purposely timing my arrival to match the exact duration of a round trip to Cleveland. When I pulled into the driveway, Mark was out on his front lawn, casually tossing a football with another neighbor from down the street. He looked over at my car, raised a hand, and gave me a friendly, welcoming nod. It was the exact same face that had been laughing at my expense just a few hours ago. I nodded back, suppressing the urge to drive my car straight through his manicured front porch, and walked into my house. Vanessa was sitting on the living room couch, the television playing some mindless reality show in the background. She looked up, offering a bright, warm smile that made me sick to my stomach. "Hey, you're back. How was Cleveland? How did the presentation go?" "It went exactly how I expected it to," I said, setting my briefcase down on the entryway table. I walked over to the armchair opposite the couch, sitting down heavily and staring directly into her eyes. The warmth in her expression began to flicker, replaced by a subtle, defensive tension as she noticed the complete lack of emotion on my face. "Are you okay?" she asked, leaning forward, her voice dropping into that familiar, performative tone of concern. "You look really pale, Tyler. Was the traffic bad on the way home?" "The traffic was fine," I said quietly, leaning back and pulling my phone out of my pocket. "I actually didn't go to Cleveland today, Vanessa." She blinked, her smile faltering completely. "What do you mean? You left at 6 this morning. Where were you?" "I was here," I replied, my voice steady, entirely devoid of inflection. "I was sitting in the basement." A look of profound confusion crossed her face, followed immediately by a sharp, sudden paleness as her brain desperately tried to calculate what that meant. "The basement? Why would you be in the basement? Tyler, you're acting really weird. You're scaring me." "I think you should look at this," I said, hitting play on the video file and sliding the phone across the coffee table toward her. The living room went entirely silent, except for the low audio playing from the phone speaker. On the screen, the digital footage showed Vanessa walking into the foyer in her blue summer dress, followed seconds later by Mark unlocking the front door with our emergency key. The audio captured her giggle, her mocking comments about my promotion, and Mark's low laugh about how oblivious I was. I watched her face as she looked down at the screen. The transformation was absolute. The color drained from her skin until she looked completely gray. Her eyes widened in horror, her lips parting as she watched herself throw her arms around our neighbor's neck. She tried to slide the screen away, her fingers trembling so violently she almost knocked her wine glass off the table. "Tyler, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice cracking as the desperate, instinctive gaslighting began. "Mark he came over to help me with something in the house, and I was feeling lonely, and it was just a stupid, meaningless mistake. It just happened today. I swear to you, it was a one-time thing." "Save it," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her frantic lies like a blade. "I was in the shower yesterday when he walked into the bathroom, Vanessa. I heard you both talking about the keys. I heard you planning the afternoon. I know about the ATM withdrawals by the boutique hotel on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I know everything." She froze, realizing the wall she was trying to build had already been demolished before she even started. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. She dropped her head into her hands, bursting into loud, hysterical sobs, reaching across the table to grab my sleeve. "Tyler, please don't do this. We can go to counseling. We can fix this." "I love you. I was just stupid. I was feeling neglected with your work schedule." "Do not blame my job for your lack of morality," I said, standing up and pulling my arm out of her reach. "The locks on the house are being changed tomorrow morning. My attorney has already filed the petition for divorce, and the court will be receiving a full copy of that video, along with every financial record from our shared account. You have until noon tomorrow to pack whatever can fit into your car and leave." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup, looking utterly broken. The polished, confident woman from the video was gone, replaced by someone drowning in the consequences of her own arrogance. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered. I looked out the living room window, staring across the dark lawn toward the warm, glowing lights of the house next door.
Go ask Mark. I'm sure he has a spare key." Turning my back on her sobbing, I walked upstairs to the guest bedroom, closing and locking the door behind me. As I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room, the crushing weight of the betrayal finally caught up to me. But beneath the pain, there was a profound, unshakable sense of freedom. The life I thought I had was completely gone, but as I looked out at the quiet Ohio suburbs, I knew that the truth had set me free, and they would be left to burn in the ashes of what they had destroyed.